COVID-19. Okay, welcome everybody to this second panel of our symposium today on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic in the Americas and the borderland region of US-Mexico border. This panel concerns issues of migration and governance. Before we get started, I'd just like to introduce and welcome our four presenters today. From Chiapas in Mexico, we're very pleased to welcome two very good friends and colleagues, Dr. Jesús Solís and Dr. Daniel Villafuerte. I'd just like to say a few introductory comments about each. Dr. Solís received his doctorate in social anthropology from El Colegio de Michoacán. He's a researcher and full-time professor at the Center for Advanced Studies in Mexico and Central America, or CESMECA, at the University of Sciences and Arts of Chiapas, UNICACH. He was director of that center in the period from August 2017 to July 2021. He's also the co-founder and member of the Observatory on Democracies in Southern Mexico and Central America, ODEMCA, which is located at the same institute, the CESMECA that I mentioned. Dr. Daniel Villafuerte received his doctorate in social sciences from the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana in Mexico City and is currently full-time researcher and professor at the same Center for Advanced Research on Mexico and Central America at the University of Sciences and Arts of Chiapas. He is a recipient of many awards, including the Premio Jesús Silva Herzog, which was given in recognition for his work by the Institute for Economic Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico in 2003. And he is a member of the International Network on Migration and Development with many publications on those issues. Welcome, Daniel. Bienvenido. Our next speaker will be Berta Bermudez Tapia. Berta is an assistant professor in the sociology department at New Mexico State University. Welcome, Berta, to NMSU. And her research has been funded by the Institute of Behavioral Sciences at the University of Colorado in Boulder, the Mexican National Science Foundation, and the Tinker Foundation. And she specializes in multiple conceptualizations of violence and policies regulating migration and asylum. She's been working with the local migrant shelters at the Texas-Tamaulipas border since 2016 and with the Matamoros and Reynosa camp since 2019. And we'll be listening to some of that research a bit later. Finally, we welcome Thea Clement. Thea is currently pursuing her master's in peace and justice at the University of San Diego with a focus on community-based mediation and immigration reform. She is particularly interested in the role of interreligious dialogue and non-Western cultural rhetorical education in this work. Prior to attending the Joan B. Croce School of Peace Studies, Thea spent 6 years working for nonprofits in Greece, where she worked in refugee aid programming and across East and West Africa on public health education and political advocacy initiatives. Thea received her bachelor's degree from Oberlin College and is a native of Las Cruces. So welcome home, Thea, virtually at least. One day we'll have you here in person, surely. So as you can see, we have a really great lineup here. We're going to begin with Dr. Solís. If you'd like to share the screen, Dr. Solís, and I'll be doing simultaneous translation from Spanish to English. And thank you everybody in the audience for attending.
Muchas gracias, doctor Harvey. Gracias también por la invitación a participar en este simposio. Agradecer a los organizadores, a los colegas que han estado en la organización de este simposio también para la invitación. Yo he preparado unas diapositivas para mi presentación, entonces intentaré ahora compartirla. ver. Ahí va, espero que pueda lograr la transmisión de la pantalla. Bueno, en tanto se logra la transmisión de la pantalla,
Tengo una idea, una propuesta, Jesús, si me quieres
debo decir que esta
por
presentación
electrónico.
la he titulado de un modo políticos en el sur de México. ¿Sí?
Sí, estoy pensando si me lo quieres mandar por correo electrónico, la presentación, a ver si yo puedo subirlo desde acá.
Sí, perdón. Ah, ok. Se la envié hace un par de días, pero la puedo volver a enviar.
Déjame buscarlo, a ver si lo puedo subir yo. Ah, sí, ya lo encontré.
Sí, ok.
Gracias. Entonces déjame bajarlo, abrirlo, tenerlo listo aquí. Ahora sí. Eso está
Esta es la
extrañado.
de Daniel.
Ok, permíteme un segundo.
Pero, ajá.
Ahora sí.
Perfecto, le agradezco mucho.
Listo.
La he titulado, muchas gracias.
Nada.
La he titulado Crisis y conflictos políticos en el sur de México en el contexto de la pandemia por COVID-19. Forma parte de un trabajo más amplio que he venido realizando en torno a el registro de los cambios políticos en el sur de México y de manera mucho más sureño de Chiapas. Forma también parte de las inquietudes de un equipo de investigación que hemos estado trabajando desde hace ya 8 años en torno a temas de democracia y cambios políticos en el sur de México y en Centroamérica, que estamos agrupados, organizados en el América, precisamente. Entonces, si vamos a la siguiente, por favor. El objetivo en esta presentación es pues, hacer una revisión general de los conflictos políticos en el sur de México, haciendo particular énfasis pues, en el marco de la crisis generada por la pandemia, es decir, los últimos 2 años. Me interesa reflexionar de manera también un poco general en torno al desarrollo democrático en el sur de México, con especial atención a la política subnacional, a la habilidad democrática en el nivel municipal, de tipo económica, social y de seguridad. Para esto sitúo 2 premisas, 2 planteamientos básicos. El primero es que la democracia en México ha tenido como una de sus vías más importantes de afianzamiento, o sea, de fortalecimiento al gobierno local, el fortalecimiento de la democracia en México. Y la otra premisa es que la crisis sanitaria causada por la pandemia pues se suma a una crisis crónicas, ¿no? Como intentaré mostrar en la región, ¿no? Allí, perdón. Al cierre de la exposición, trataré de referir algunas respuestas locales. Esto en las respuestas que están emergiendo en términos de conflictos, los conflictos que se están generando en la región sur, y cómo estas se están proponiendo, o por el contrario, están desafiando los muy débiles, considero yo, márgenes de gobernabilidad democrática en los espacios locales. La siguiente, por favor. Bueno, una vista muy general al sur-sureste de México. El sur-sureste de México está integrado por 9 estados, 9 entidades. Ustedes las pueden ver allí. O sea, en el lado del Pacífico, 3 entidades: Guerrero, Oaxaca, Chiapas. Al centro del país, Puebla. Y por el lado del Golfo y el Caribe, tenemos a Veracruz, Tabasco, Campeche, Yucatán y Quintana Roo. Entonces son 9 los estados que conforman el sur-sureste. Y de estos 9, 4 estados hacen frontera con Guatemala y Belice, siendo Chiapas la extensión de frontera más amplia con Guatemala, ¿no? Y es allí precisamente el corredor migratorio más importante del sur, la frontera sur. Seguro de esto nos conversará el doctor Villafuerte más adelante. Y también esta frontera con Guatemala se comparte por el lado del estado de Tabasco. Algunos rasgos que comparten las entidades del sur-sureste de México, rasgos de tipo estructural, y aquí habría que también hacer una acotación en el sentido de que estos rasgos que tienen que ver con la situación económica, social y política de la entidad están dadas en el marco también de polos de desarrollo en el Caribe mexicano, lo que tiene que ver principalmente con el turismo, en el Golfo de México con los desarrollos portuarios, importantes desarrollos portuarios, Veracruz, Tabasco ahora también como una entidad con desarrollos portuarios importantes. Sin embargo, estos polos de desarrollo no inhiben, ¿no?, tendencias históricas estructurales de la región sur-sureste, ¿no? Y estos rasgos son, pues, una economía sentada principalmente en el sector primario, con agricultura predominantemente de subsistencia, un mercado laboral regional pues bastante inestable, o sea, los polos estos de desarrollo que refería están básicamente para ocupación en empleos pues muy bajos, ¿no? De muy bajo salario, bajos ingresos, y el mercado en ese sentido pues no permite la captación precisamente de la mano trabajadora, la mano de obra de la región sur, ¿no? Se suma a esto pues una crisis agropecuaria crónica y que se ha visto profundizada pues en ciertos momentos por fenómenos naturales como los huracanes, finales de la década de los 90, principios de los 2000, que golpearon muy fuertemente la región sur. Inundaciones también muy grandes en la primera, en la segunda mitad, perdón, de los años 2000 en la región sureste. Hay entonces en esta región una desigualdad y una pobreza social muy marcada en la población, en gran parte de la población. Es también la población del sur-sureste mayoritariamente indígena, de 8 estados en todo México que registran la mayor presencia de población indígena, 6 se localizan en el sur-sureste, lo cual habla, ¿no?, de la predominancia de la población indígena en la región sur-sureste. La siguiente, por favor. Y bueno, dentro del sur-sureste mexicano, también llamado el sur profundo, ¿no?, conformado por 3 estados que son Guerrero, Oaxaca y Chiapas, y estas entidades pues también tienen algunos rasgos, ¿no?, compartidos, y algunos ya he mencionado antes, pero solo quisiera enfatizar algunos más para el caso de estas 3 entidades, ¿no? Una de estas es la conflictividad social, persistente también, digamos, la gestación de movimientos sociales y de movimientos armados en la región sur, en estas entidades es histórica también, en la historia reciente, contemporánea, es un rasgo que lo distingue. La conflictividad política que va ligado con ello, movimientos locales por la democratización que se desarrollaron también tempranamente en estas entidades, sobre todo como procesos de desestructuración de cacicazgos del partido predominante en el gobierno, el PRI, y reclamaciones de movimientos en términos de derechos diferenciados, movimientos étnicos, movimientos sectoriales, el movimiento magisterial, el movimiento estudiantil, etc. Decía de la población mayoritariamente indígena, del 75% de población a nivel nacional, el 44.3% está ubicado en estas 3 entidades, ¿no?, lo cual da todavía mayor claridad sobre la población que ocupan estas entidades, ¿no? Algunas persistencias estructurales en la región, como ya señalaba previamente, tienen que ver con indicadores de desarrollo humano, lo que tiene que ver con educación, salud, ingreso. En estas entidades es en donde se registran los mayores índices de rezago, los mayores niveles menores niveles, perdón, de desarrollo en el país. Los niveles de pobreza son muy altos en esta subregión. En Chiapas, por ejemplo, el 75% de la población está en condición de pobreza, ¿no? Por dar algunos ejemplos de la situación. Lo que tenemos entonces en esta región es una ausencia del Estado en términos sociales, políticos, y tenemos, por otro lado, una fuerte presencia estatal pero armada, ¿no?, una gradual militarización de toda esta región. O sea, hay un retiro del Estado social y de gobierno en ese sentido, y por otro lado, pues una presencia armada del Estado pues muy fuerte en ese lado. A este contexto general yo solo le agregaría 2 nuevos rasgos en la región. Digamos que esto ocurre sobre todo después del año 2000, que tiene que ver con la expoliación vía el neoextractivismo, la minería, los hidrocarburos, etcétera. Es una nueva situación en la región. Y también, y esto me parece importante para efectos de la exposición, marcarlo, el asedio y la captura de los gobiernos locales por la delincuencia organizada. En correlación con todo esto, pues el incremento de la violencia privada ligada a grupos criminales organizados. La siguiente, por favor.
Bien, I would just want to add for the translation purposes what Dr. Solís just added to what you can read on the slides with two additional factors that are affecting southern Mexico in particular. One is the expansion of extractive industries, mining, particularly affecting indigenous lands. And the second is the capture of local government by violent criminal organizations and drug cartels. Jesús, I just wanted to point out you have about 5 minutes left of your presentation. Tienes como 5 minutos para terminar la presentación. Jesús, gracias.
Sí, de acuerdo, muchas gracias. Bueno, en términos de política, quizás solo decir, bueno, en México el proceso de cambio en términos de la democracia electoral contemporánea, la transición votada en el 2000, etcétera, y allí un efecto también trasladado a las entidades, ¿no? En términos de transiciones, pluripartidismo, competencia y alternancia partidista, ¿no? En el nivel subregional. En todo esto también lo que vemos por otro lado es, como decía, pues una serie de captura de los gobiernos locales por grupos delictivos, un control político territorial que hacen también, ¿no? Los grupos criminales organizados, y lo que esto implica es pues un desafío a la vía tradicional democrática. O sea, el gobierno municipal había sido, ¿no? En México una vía por la cual se habían abierto procesos de democratización. Hay una serie de rasgos que dan cuenta precisamente de esa descomposición a nivel local, ¿no? La violencia ha empeorado en los municipios, la violencia política también, en materia política también, asesinatos de funcionarios, exfuncionarios o candidatos a puestos de elección municipal se ha incrementado, y lo cual también hace difícil la gobernabilidad en estos espacios locales. Avanzamos a la siguiente, por favor. Vamos a las últimas 2 diapositivas. Bueno, y algunas respuestas a lo que ya he planteado de esta situación tienen que ver con movimientos, ¿no? Acciones de resistencia y protestas derivadas precisamente de esta situación que se está viviendo a nivel regional, subregional, ¿no? Muchas de estas agravadas precisamente en el contexto de la pandemia. El acceso a la justicia pues se congeló, o sea, se cerraron juzgados, las policías incluso locales se convirtieron más bien en contenedoras de movilidad humana, ¿no? En ciertos espacios, haciendo menos las funciones de policías. Hay entonces un incremento de la violencia, menos gobernabilidad, y algunas de las respuestas más destacadas son las que tienen que ver con propuestas autoorganizativas de comunidades en diferentes espacios, ¿no? En Guerrero tenemos por un lado lo que ha sido nombrado como policías comunitarias, que son policías que van precisamente en defensa de sus espacios, de sus territorios, ¿no? Ante precisamente la situación de inseguridad que se viven en sus espacios locales. Uno de los principios que enarbolan estas policías comunitarias es el del autogobierno, ¿no? Con base en sus prácticas de justicia local, sus instituciones políticas, sociales y culturales locales, y es una forma de respuesta precisamente a este contexto de agravamiento. La siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Y en Chiapas también observamos esta misma situación, ¿no? Lo que observamos es procesos autoorganizativos comunitarios que no son nuevos, esto yo creo que es importante decirlo. Lo nuevo aquí es que están emergiendo en el contexto precisamente de una violencia criminal asociada a grupos del crimen organizado que, según denuncian estos mismos grupos comunitarios, estos grupos del crimen organizado han tomado los gobiernos locales, ¿no? Entonces, hoy la disputa por este espacio local de poder se está dando en un terreno más allá de lo político. O sea, se está dando en una confrontación abierta y hostil, ¿no? En la que se anteponen precisamente estas formas comunitarias y además un poder de fuego. O sea, ustedes son comunidades autoorganizadas y armadas también para restablecer gobierno y policía, ¿no? Y también las formas discursivas en que se enuncia esta disputa, o sea, no a los partidos políticos, o sea, hay un antipartidismo marcado, y lo que se propone, por otro lado, es un autogobierno asentado sobre usos y costumbres de los pueblos. Aquí, finalmente, yo cerraría con los desafíos de esta situación. Por un lado, ¿no? Está la cuestión de orden más institucional, o sea, los márgenes de legalidad en que se mueven los grupos en disputa, o sea, son grupos armados, ¿no? Sobre un territorio político para controlar el poder político, y la legalidad en la que se mueven es para justamente repensarse. Y por otro lado, está la posibilidad o la imposibilidad precisamente de concretar gobiernos, ¿no? democráticos en estos espacios locales ante esa situación. Eso me parece a mí que son los desafíos más importantes que se enfrentan ahora en términos de los procesos de democratización en los municipios en el sur del país. Y con eso concluyo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Solís. Muy bien. Espero que en las preguntas podemos abundar aún más en estos temas. Son muy importantes y conflictivos el cuadro que pintas de la situación en el sureste mexicano. Vamos a seguir en la misma región con la presentación del doctor Daniel Villafuerte. So thank you, Dr. Solís, for your presentation. I'm sure there'll be time for some questions if folks would like to use the Q&A button during the session and get those ready for the time we will have at the end of the panel. We're going to stay with the same region of southern Mexico and the border with Central America. Our next speaker is Dr. Daniel Villafuerte, who I introduced briefly beforehand, so we're going to go straight to the presentation. Welcome, Dr. Villafuerte, bienvenido. And would you like to share your screen? ¿Vas a compartir la página o sí? Adelante.
Voy a intentar. Bueno, ahí está. Sí se ve, ¿verdad? Bueno, good morning, buenos días. Muchas gracias por la invitación a este simposio. Voy a hablar sobre todo a grandes rasgos sobre la política migratoria en la frontera sur de México de los últimos años, particularmente en el contexto de la pandemia.
I'll be translating as we go, if that's okay. I'll just be very brief, and that way everyone can participate. So Dr. Villafuerte is going to be talking about, he's been studying migration for some time, and now the focus is on what the specific context is with the COVID-19 pandemic for migration from southern Mexico. Adelante.
Okay. Bueno, para visualizar qué es la frontera sur de México, aquí tenemos lo que se llama en azul, en esta parte, el triángulo norte de Centroamérica, que son los flujos más importantes que entran al territorio mexicano por la frontera sur. Y estos son los puntos más significativos: Tapachula, y por el lado de Tabasco, hacia esta parte. Y es todo el tránsito hacia el norte. Aquí ven otro mapa donde se aprecia con mayor claridad los municipios fronterizos de Chiapas y del resto de los estados que conforman la frontera sur de México. Es el caso de Tabasco, es el caso de Campeche y el caso de Quintana Roo.
Dr. Villafuerte, with these two maps, is showing us that the largest number of migrants coming through Mexico, coming through the southern border of the state of Chiapas and the other border states such as Tabasco, are with what are known as the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And you can see in the maps the particular places where, or the municipalities where migrants are crossing: Tapachula on the close to the Pacific coast side of Chiapas, and a bit further north with the border with Tabasco state. Thank you. Bien.
Una imagen muy importante que recorre el mundo es esta primera caravana que ocurre en octubre de 2018, donde son sorprendidas básicamente las autoridades de Centroamérica, de Guatemala particularmente, y de México, Chiapas, por la cantidad de migrantes reunidos justamente en la frontera sur de México. Esta es otra imagen tomada desde el puente que divide Chiapas con Guatemala. Estamos hablando de cerca de 7,000 migrantes centroamericanos fundamentalmente, pero que también se unieron ahí migrantes del Caribe, particularmente de Cuba y Venezuela. Esta imagen corresponde a una segunda caravana, cuando ya la Policía Federal de México instala un cerco para evitar justamente la entrada de migrantes. Y aquí se produce pues el rompimiento de este cerco y logra penetrar una buena cantidad de migrantes centroamericanos a territorio mexicano. Bueno, estas imágenes nos dan una idea.
Sorry, perdón, la traducción breve. So we've seen internationally quite well known the caravans of migrants coming from Central America. Particularly, we've seen that in the news in the United States, and those photographs were showing two caravans. One, the first in 2018, which surprised the authorities in the Central American countries and Mexico because of its size. There are around 7,000 migrants, mostly from Central America, but also from the Caribbean, including Cuba, and also from Venezuela. The second photograph included the second caravan, which by now the Mexican Federal Police had responded to and set up a blockade at the Mexican border with Guatemala to stop the caravan, but the caravan broke through, and you see how many people were involved in that caravan in the image. Gracias, adelante.
Este volumen desproporcionado, masivo, que se ven reflejados en las caravanas, llevó justamente a la constitución de un programa de contención migratoria. En el primero, pues se trata del programa Frontera Sur, también denominado Plan Sur, instaurado por el gobierno de Enrique Peña Nieto a partir de 1914, y hablamos del 2014 justamente porque ahí se produce la gran crisis que se denominó de los niños migrantes, cuando fueron capturados en la frontera sur de Estados Unidos alrededor de 62,000 pequeños migrantes centroamericanos. Este programa dura justamente hasta el 2018, cuando comienzan las caravanas. Y básicamente se trata de un programa de contención, de detención y deportación de migrantes a sus lugares de origen. En este periodo de 2014 a 2018, 5 años de aplicación del programa Plan Sur, se deportaron en promedio 107,000 migrantes por año. Concluido este programa, entra al gobierno de México Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Todavía estaba en funciones el presidente Donald Trump, y se acuerda una serie de mecanismos para contener la migración. Entonces estamos hablando de un acuerdo que se firma en el 2019 y que va a tener como consecuencia justamente el endurecimiento de las medidas de contención con la recién estrenada Guardia Nacional y participación de elementos del Ejército Mexicano. Y aquí en estos 3 años, de 2019 a 2021, vemos que el promedio de detención alcanza los 103,000 migrantes por año. Es decir, si lo comparamos con el programa Plan Sur, vamos a ver que son cifras muy similares que se capturan, que se deportan por año. En el caso, en este último periodo, con el acuerdo migratorio con López Obrador y Donald Trump, también vemos un muy importante, que es justamente el incremento significativo que va teniendo las solicitudes de refugio. Aquí tenemos un promedio de 37,000 por año, ¿verdad? Y que además, si nosotros tomamos en cuenta las medidas de confinamiento, vamos a ver que el fenómeno migratorio realmente desbordó a la frontera sur de México.
Okay, thank you. So we've been seeing large-scale migration from Central America into Mexico, and this has led to policies from the Mexican government of containment. The previous administration of Enrique Peña Nieto in 2014 established a new Plan Sur, and that was at the time of when around 62,000 migrant children were detained at the US-Mexico border. This Plan Sur increased detention, deportation from Mexico back to Central America, and it lasts until the caravans in 2018 occurred. In the period of 2014 to 18, around 107,000 people were deported from Mexico. When the new president, López Obrador, came in 2018, it was still the time when Donald Trump was president, and an agreement was established between the two governments to continue with policies of containment of migration. And they signed in 2019 a new accord on this. And the consequence has been the hardening of containment measures. But now with the new National Guard that the new government of Mexico had created, and also with the elements of the Mexican military supporting this containment effort. So if you look at the period under AMLO, López Obrador, from 2019 to 21, there's been an average of around 103,000 people who are detained and deported, which is about the same as it was under Peña Nieto and his policy. Thank you.
Dentro de los acuerdos ya recientes, como medidas antimigrantes, se acuerda la externalización de la frontera sur de Estados Unidos hacia el sur de México, hacia Centroamérica. Y para ello se van a firmar 3 acuerdos importantes. Con Guatemala, el 26 de julio, se firma un acuerdo en la Casa Blanca. Con El Salvador, el 20 de septiembre de 2019 también. Y con Honduras el 25 de septiembre. Esto como medidas para contener la migración centroamericana, para que se queden en los países, particularmente en Guatemala, que va a funcionar como una gran barrera de contención para evitar que pasen a territorio mexicano y por lo tanto puedan transitar hasta la frontera norte de México y sur de Estados Unidos.
So we see in 2019 agreements between the Trump administration and the governments of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras on those dates that you can see there on the slide, which created agreement that those countries would accept being what are known as safe third countries, so that migrants who went into one of those countries would be deemed in a safe country rather than being given permission to enter the United States. This is also part of the policy of moving really the enforcement of the US border, the US southern border, further south to Mexico's border with Central America and to those Central American countries themselves.
Otras dos medidas importantes durante el gobierno de Donald Trump fue justamente la cancelación de lo que se llama el estatus de protección temporal a migrantes que por diversos eventos de violencia, de terremotos, de huracanes, fueron admitidos en Estados Unidos y suman alrededor de 400,000 migrantes, particularmente de El Salvador, de Honduras, Nicaragua, de Haití y de otros países fuera del continente. En el 6 de noviembre de 2017 se anuncia la cancelación de este acuerdo de protección temporal con Nicaragua. El 8 de enero de 2018 también se anuncia la terminación de la protección temporal con El Salvador y el 4 de mayo de 2018 también la cancelación con Honduras. Al mismo tiempo que se anuncia la terminación de este estatus de protección temporal, también en el 2017 el fiscal Jeff Sessions anuncia el fin del DACA. El DACA es un programa muy importante, como todos ustedes saben, que protege alrededor de 750,000 migrantes jóvenes que llegaron siendo niños a Estados Unidos y que hoy están en universidades o están trabajando, etcétera. Y esto representa pues medidas muy duras del gobierno de Donald Trump.
So this slide talks of attempts by the Trump administration to end two very big programs of benefit to migrants. The Temporary Protected Status Program, TPS, which has covered around 400,000 migrants since the end of the 90s. And the DACA program, which has protected from deportation children brought to the United States without the legal documentation when they were very young. So this is also part of the context in which migration policy has been implemented. Daniel, tenemos como 5 minutos total entre lo que presentas y lo que yo puedo traducir.
Ok, bueno. Voy rápido. Bueno, aquí para tener una idea de lo que ya dije, los dos periodos, el primer periodo que corresponde al Plan Sur, aquí tenemos por países la cantidad de migrantes deportados. Tenemos el periodo de López Obrador, también por países, la cantidad de deportados. Y la última columna tenemos del 2019 al 2021, la cantidad de solicitudes de refugio por país. Aquí es lo mismo, nada más que está presentado por promedios anuales por país. La cantidad de deportados, 23,000 en El Salvador, 55,000 para el caso de Guatemala y casi 50,000 para el caso de Honduras. Lo mismo tenemos para el caso del periodo de López Obrador, con 10,000 para El Salvador, 40,000 para Guatemala y más de 52,000 para el caso de Honduras. Honduras es, digamos, que el paradigma de la expulsión de personas, familias, niños, jóvenes hacia México con destino a Estados Unidos.
So those two tables included data on the previous administration up until 2018 and the current administration on deportations from Mexico to Central America. And you can see a large number affecting Honduras, particularly recently, which, as Dr. Villafuerte just pointed out, is like a paradigm case of forced migration from the region.
Aquí en esta gráfica lo único que quiero ilustrar es cómo con la pandemia cae la cantidad de solicitudes de refugio, pero ya en el 2021 alcanza un nivel exponencial. Estamos hablando de 130,000 solicitudes de refugio en el 2021.
So can I just say about that? Could you go back, please? Puedes regresar la diapositiva para poder traducirlo. The important thing about this one is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see a dip in 2020 in the number of people who from Central America applying for asylum in Mexico. And that is because of people not being able to leave their communities in that part. Everything was shut down or closed down. But then you see that spike in 2021 to over 36,000 presenting asylum petitions at the border in Mexico. Gracias.
Esta es la misma, nada más que está por meses. Y aquí se ve también la misma tendencia.
This is just by month.
Sí.
So we'll have to, tenemos que concluir en 3 palabras o 4.
Me voy a las conclusiones rápidamente.
Bien.
Primera cuestión, que nos encontramos en un punto de crisis muy fuerte. Las solicitudes de refugio van en aumento. Las medidas aplicadas de contención de Donald Trump no han dado resultados. A un año de gobierno del presidente Biden, no se han cumplido las promesas de campaña en materia migratoria. El paquete legislativo que fue presentado en el 2021 para abrir el camino a la ciudadanización para 8 millones de migrantes no ha pasado por el Congreso. El planteamiento que compete a este paquete, los Dreamers, TPS y la protección para 1 millón de trabajadores irregulares que trabajan en el campo de Estados Unidos, tampoco ha pasado por el Congreso.
So in conclusion, we're facing a very serious crisis of migration still. The number of asylum petitions is still increasing. The containment policies that we saw under Donald Trump have not really contained. The Biden administration is not following through on its promises, and legislation in Congress on immigration reform is stalled. Adelante.
Okay. Entonces, en esta idea de contener la migración, México ha comprometido $30 millones, básicamente para 2 programas, que es Sembrando Vida, y en su versión compartida con Estados Unidos se llama Sembrando Oportunidades, y Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro. Estados Unidos ha comprometido a aportar $4,000 millones por año, digo por un periodo de 5 años, y ha convocado a diversas empresas globales para invertir en la región del Triángulo Norte de Centroamérica. Hago aquí el comparativo entre las promesas y lo que Estados Unidos acaba de aprobar para, en este marco de la guerra con Ucrania, de $15,000 millones, ¿no? Mientras que para Centroamérica todavía no llegan los prometidos 900 millones para 2022. Con esto voy a terminar, está la promesa de cancelar el título 42, que ha tenido un importante papel en la deportación de una cantidad enorme de migrantes que han llegado a la frontera sur de Estados Unidos. Y previsión del retiro del título 42 a finales de mayo, se ha planteado, en primer lugar, reforzar la frontera sur de Estados Unidos con la aplicación de un presupuesto adicional de $1,400 millones en lo que resta del año de 2022. Y para el año fiscal 2023, la contratación de 300 nuevos agentes de la patrulla fronteriza y 300 coordinadores para procesar las solicitudes que lleguen al sur de Estados Unidos. Con esto concluyo, por favor, gracias.
Gracias. So thank you. In the previous slides, Dr. Villafuerte pointed out that Mexico has invested $30 million in rural development projects and in youth employment projects in Central America to try and address root causes. The United States government under the Biden administration has also invested a total of $4 billion in Central American countries of the Northern Triangle. And there's a contrast here that Dr. Villafuerte pointed out that the European Union, the United States is investing $15 billion compared to $4 billion, $15 billion in Ukraine. In response, of course, to the terrible crisis there. Another factor to take into consideration is what is happening now with the lifting of Title 42, the public health measure that's been used to not even allow asylum seekers to come into the United States to present asylum claims. That's been in effect since March of 2020 and is about to be lifted on May the 23rd. Along with that, the expectation that migration from Mexico, or through Mexico rather, and into the United States will increase without the Title 42 restrictions. And in that moment, the United States government has announced that it is increasing the budget by $1.4 billion for border enforcement in 2022 and increasing the hiring of Border Patrol, at least 300 new Border Patrol agents and 300 others in the coordinating of patrolling the border. So that's the reality that we have in front of us right now. Just a note on that, on the Title 42 measure, Zaira Martin is one of our other participants in the symposium, and she'll be talking about that on the public health panel later today. So I'll leave it there and thank you, Dr. Villafuerte.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Dr. Berta Bermudez-Tapia. And if you'd like to share the screen, we can go ahead.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you so much for the invitation to being here. This is actually going to be very interesting because what I'm going to present is going to be an extension of what Dr. Villafuerte and Dr. Solís were talking of what's happening on the southern border of Mexico. So I'm going to move all the way to the northern border of Mexico. I'm going to talk about what happened in these border regions after, because of the effects of COVID-19 and immigration policies such as Title 42. So I want to start with this quote from Luisa. She's an asylum seeker who's living in the Matamoros camp. And this is a quote about when she just arrived into Matamoros after being expelled. And she says, I live like everyone else in the plaza. I came here with my son. We slept in the sidewalk a few nights until I met a woman with a baby who let us stay in her tent. After a week, we got a quilt that helped with the cold. However, the rain came and we needed to use the quilt as a barrier on the edges of the tent to keep the water from getting inside. So this is just a quote to give you a sense of how I was living in the Matamoros camp. So about some of the background, even though the other panelists already talk about this a little bit. So the US-Mexico border, it's going to be turning into a hardened and militarized area where two forces are going to converge. The Washington's border enforcement campaign and an ongoing war against the drug cartel domination in Mexico. So these two forces have exacerbated a web of racialized gender and class violence that people waiting or attempting to cross the border experience in the different border cities. Particularly today, I'm going to talk to you about the city of Matamoros and a little bit about the city of Reynosa and how they are experiencing this important migratory movement comprised of people from Southern Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean seeking asylum in the United States. If you are not familiar with the area I'm talking about, is this dark green area that I'm discussing, that is the Rio Grande Valley. So here is a timeline for us to kind of follow what was going on in terms of immigration policies, but also when COVID hit. And so everything's gonna start, at least in these border regions, in 2018. And things are gonna get a little bit complicated because of the implementation of metering on entry regulations. What this does is CBP officers, or Custom Borders and Protection officers, are gonna stand in the dividing line between Mexico and the United States, and they are going to physically impede asylum seekers to request asylum legally. Very fast, migrants notice that there is kind of a way out of metering, so they are going to start paying smugglers to help them circumvent the metering by helping them to cross the river. This is going to be happening in 2018. We're going to start seeing some families gathering near the ports of entry, but really there's not going to be like a big agglomeration because folks are going to be paying the smugglers. However, 2019 is going to change the picture dramatically with the migrant protection protocols. This is a policy that is going to say, okay, anybody who wants to request asylum in the United States have to wait in Mexico until the duration of their hearings and their process to request asylum. This policy pushed by 2019 almost 50,000 migrants back into Mexico. 13,000 of them were returned to Matamoros. People were living in a small plaza in front of the Gateway International Bridge during that year. However, everything's going to change in 2020, and that's going to be the year of COVID-19. What is going to happen first is that all asylum procedures are going to be suspended, and Title 42 is going to be enforced. That means that everybody who was there because of migrant protection protocols couldn't move, and they didn't know when they're going to cross because all their hearings were suspended. And the other part was that anybody else could request asylum anymore, and people are going to be expelled into Mexico without any documentation because of Title 42. Later in 2021 and 2022, and this talks about what Dr. Villafuerte was saying, Biden came into the presidency, and yes, he ended, or his administration ended, the first version of MPP. However, first, Title 42 was never touched by his administration, so things keep like happening more or less in a similar situation. I'm going to tell you about some of the changes in a little bit. And afterwards, his administration is going to be forced to implement MPP 2.0 again. So really, there is not much of a change in these policies right now. Everybody is expecting the end of Title 42 by May 23rd, but there's a lot of pushbacks from different governors and even the Congress. So I don't know what's going to happen. I truly doubt that this is going to be an easy fix and that they're going to be able to end Title 42 just like that, and people are going to be able to cross. But let's see what's going to happen. So this is a map of the area where the Matamoros camp started. So here, this is a small plaza. So every time I refer to a plaza in Matamoros, this is where the camps start growing. But the difference, something important here is that this tents extended all the way until here and all the way here. So it was kind of the plaza plus some arms where different tents were extended. Later, after COVID-19, INAMI, that it's the migration officers in Mexico, and some NGOs are gonna decide to relocate all these people to this levee that it's right here. And this is where the Matamoros camp is going to exist from 2020 to 2021. There are some positives and negatives of these changes. In terms of violence, the situation in this levee was way more violent. And the other problem was that this is an area that is designed strictly to flood, to save the city in case of a hurricane, for example. So during the rain season, people experience like a lot of flooding, and there was a risk at some point that the river was going to take over the whole camp. And when they were living here in the sidewalks of the plaza, people were not that afraid of flooding and didn't have to be like at the risk of, for example, all their belongings to be full of mud. And the other thing is that in all this area, there is not public lighting. And here they did have some public lighting to navigate stuff during the night. So here are some, this is an image of how the plaza looked like. And then this is how they relocate the whole thing. This is the plaza, and then they relocated through this area. This is 2020. Later on, a lot of this, the tags that I have here changed, but this is for you to see how the NGOs installed different wash stations, bedrooms, diner areas, and pavilions to protect some of the tents. Here is another comparative image. This is before COVID-19, and this is how people were living in the plaza, and then how they start using part of the upper hill of the levee also to install some tents. But here is the after, and this is where I want to call your attention in terms of this idea of lasting temporariness and how people start building. At the interior, for example, of these structures that you see here, they have the same tents, but they didn't know when COVID-19 were going to allow them to cross, when their hearings were going to be reestablished. So people just start building inside the camp. This is another example, and this has to be with the kitchens. This is back in 2018. This photo was in 2018. Then this is very close to 2019, and you can see the progression of how they, not knowing when this was gonna end, become on this like building of infrastructure and just like trying to build a city inside this levee in order to survive. So this is the progression of the kitchens, starting from holes on the ground all the way to this image over here. Then when the Matamoros camp was active, this was actually a community kitchen. This is another kitchen that is just like a regular kitchen of a family, but this is a community kitchen. Then here are
4 minutes.
Yes.
Sorry, 4 minutes, please.
Yeah, I know. Here I have another example of how this grew. So this is another view of the infrastructure inside the camp. This is when people started growing gardens to make this look pretty, because they didn't know for how long they were going to be there. And I think the most important thing that happened with COVID-19 and Title 42 was the rise of a new camp. So in March 2021, as Biden promised, the Matamoros camp closed. These are the images of the Matamoros camp in 2021. And this is what happened in 2021 or in the city of Reynosa, because Title 42 keep expelling people, but now not through Matamoros, but through Reynosa, people start living in a new plaza. This is Plaza de la República. And here right now, almost 3,000 people are living in this plaza. And the thing is that the problem haven't been solved at all, even though MPP ended. Because of Title 42, people are now living in Reynosa. This is August 2021. This is December 2021. And from December to today, the population almost grew in 1,000 people. Here, there were living 2,000 people, and now the reports are about 3,000 people. This is how the Reynosas can reflect when it rains. I'm going to skip this slide and just to conclude my presentation by saying that yes, COVID-19 really damaged asylum seekers trying to go to the United States, but also these effects were helped with cruel immigration policies that really didn't do anything to support asylum seekers from Central America and the Caribbean. And the big example is how right now, for example, in Tijuana, Ukrainian people are having a very special shelter exclusive for them, clean, secure, safe, everything. And people from Central America and the Caribbean are still on the streets. Additionally, there is an exception of Title 42 for Ukrainians, but there is no exception for Title 42 for any of these people who has been here since 2020. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Our speaker in the panel is Thea Clements. So Thea, would you like to upload your presentation?
Absolutely, yes.
And you have 15 minutes also. And I'll just remind the audience, anybody who has a question, you can start using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. And when we get to that, we will be able to pose those questions to our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, I'm so grateful to be here today, and thank you to my fellow panelists for those excellent presentations. I think my presentation is an easy kind of segue from talking about, like Bertha mentioned, the movement or the policies that are affecting the southern border of Mexico and migrants there, and moving up more about the Baja California region, and in particular, Tijuana. So my research has been mostly a preliminary overview of the status of transgender migrants in the face of COVID-19 at the US-Mexican border. Much of my research stems from previous accounts of statistics of this population as gathered by institutes such as the William Institute prior to 2017. More recent research that I've been able to gather is really reliant on the narratives and testimonies of activists and interviews that I've conducted with expert witnesses and civil society organizations in the region. So without further ado, I would love to touch briefly on the types of terminology that does come up in the literature and you might hear me use. I think it's very relevant and important to agree on this terminology, which is something that the literature currently does not do. I'll be using the definitions as supported by the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation League, where trans is shorthand that I'll be using for transgender, which describes people whose gender identity differs from the sex they were assigned at birth. People who are transgender may also use other terms, as we will see, than those within this category. Gender nonconforming is not to be misconstrued as also transgender, but rather a term to describe people whose gender expression, as in the way that they present themselves outwardly, may differ from conventional expectations of masculinity and femininity. I'll also be using the terms LGBTQ+ and sexual and gender minority, both terms used either by the NIH, UNHCR, and GLAAD. First, I want to draw your attention to this quote by Martha Balaguera. She's a professor at the University of Toronto, and in her 2018 article on transmigration, she mentions that trans migrants undergo gender and geographical transitions that shape each other, revealing unanticipated meanings of home, refuge, mobility, freedom, and unfreedom. I think that this quote is particularly poignant as it draws our attention to the fact that migration is not only a change in one's location and physical access to resources or security, but can also be a transition in one's own personal identity, in the way that you are perceived by others and in the way that, for specifically trans people, their bodies may be changing and their gender identities might be shifting in terms of how they are externally received as they cross state and cultural borders. I hope that you keep this in mind as we consider the ways in which Mexican-American border and migration policies have impacted trans migrants. So very briefly, it's very clear that we know that COVID-19 has impacted all sorts of vulnerable populations. With regards to Latin America, trans populations have been particularly vulnerable at this time, suffering from cutbacks in healthcare, access to hormonal therapy, and treatment for AIDS or HIV, which is frequently high associated with this population. They often experience discrimination at supermarkets and so find barriers of access to food. And then the restrictive stay-at-home policies have placed many trans people in homes where sometimes, for some of them, is the first place where they experience social isolation and marginalization. Local governments have found it difficult to prosecute hate crimes, either for lack of political will or lack of the appropriate resources and education. And gang activity, which has increased in the region, does target trans people specifically for trafficking. In the Williams Institute report in 2021 that they produced covering statistics of USCIS claims, LGBT status claims came primarily from folks from the Northern Triangle, which is in alignment with the numbers we've been seeing from the other presentations today. I also want to touch briefly on my definition of vulnerability. The IOM defines vulnerability in many ways, but I'm using their 2019 definition as those susceptible to harm relative to others as a result of exposure to some form of risk factor. And these factors can span from individual to household, community, and structural. Today, I'd like to focus a bit more on the individual and structural. International aid bodies, including the UNHCR, IOM, and the World Bank, have found that foreign-born trans women who arrive at the US-Mexican border from the Northern Triangle are at particularly high risk during COVID-19, both due to their status as trans, as well as foreign-born people traveling in the region. As being stuck in a consistent state of transition, as we've seen these policies really forcing refugees and asylum seekers to exist in, foreign-born trans people who wait at the border, paired with the lack of social networks and experience of social isolation, become easy targets for gang and police violence. Many of them who already have histories of abuse or exploitation by authorities and service providers throughout the migratory route have a high tendency for then avoiding authorities, not reporting crimes, nor seeking treatment and services when they're at the border due to mistrust of these groups. With a high prevalence of HIV among the community, this group is also particularly at risk for COVID-19, as they are often immunocompromised. Activists have also talked about the stigma and lack of education on in medical care and service providers in the region. This means that in already resource restricted climates, you have providers that are unwilling or unable to respond to the specific needs of this group. For those that do manage to get into the US, detention, and this is nothing new, of course, but detention does offer a continuance of the violence that many of them have already suffered. There was a report that was put forth by the IDC in 2016 that says that the general lack of gender recognition combined with the realities of sexually segregated detention facilities creates a situation in which transgender and intersex migrants are particularly at risk for suffering severe psychological, physical, and sexual harm. These conditions have led some organizations such as the Santa Fe Dreamers Project to try to promote alternatives to detention, including recruiting sponsors who can host trans women, providing legal support, and getting them safely within the US borders that doesn't require putting them in detention, where many have died. And so because the other speakers did touch quite a bit on policy, I won't go too much. I do want to explain then, as we've seen, that there's very much a legacy of restriction. It's hard to detangle the pre-COVID and COVID-19 related border policies, as we've learned. as we see in over 2 years, a lot of these policies have built onto one another, keeping many people in states of confusion and in states of transit. In terms of the transgender community, a lot of this just subsequently puts them at more harm. Many have tried to band together and find communities with like-minded folk in areas like Tijuana, but inconsistent treatment at the border leads to a lot of confusion, a lack of proper coordination of care from service providers and directives for these groups. In the absence of governance, civil society have majorly filled the gap that is needed to protect these populations, while meanwhile xenophobic and transphobic sentiments still persist widely across the border region and in Mexico alone. I do also want to mention that Title 42 specifically has some issues revolving around the lack of data collection. So not only are people just not able to access asylum, but also these instant expulsions prevent any sort of analysis of the types of people that are presenting themselves at the border, making it even more difficult, paired with the lack of data already on trans and LGBT migrants, to understand really the reasons behind these transgender migrants and LGBT migrants seeking assistance at the US. As we also know, the US has had major influences on the shaping of Mexico policy. And with, as we mentioned before, detention often promises much worse conditions than even those outside of detention. And so with the increase in confinement and detention in Mexico, you also find that transgender migrants are at particular high risk of contracting COVID and other illnesses in these prisons and in these detention centers, and that they are left unsupported. After the release of detainees in 2021, after a bunch of civil society groups put forth some reports as to the conditions of the centers, detainees were often put back on the streets and not given support after their unlawful detention. So what has relief looked like in this area? Relief largely has looked like civil society stepping in. However, there was one break between April and August 2021 in which the American government created an expedited process for humanitarian parole visa applications. During this time, organizations like Al Otro Lado that works out of San Diego and Tijuana seized moments to process as many high-risk applications as possible. They were able to process 33 transgender asylum claimants during this time period. Once entering the US, they were able to then apply for asylum. Al Otro Lado and other civil society groups created risk assessments. However, after an interview with one of representatives from Al Otro Lado, I learned that these risk assessments received upwards of 30,000 responses and made it very difficult for the organization to process and actually deal with the contents of those responses. This has led to civil society acting more as gatekeepers and putting them sometimes at odds with the very people they're trying to help. There's also been an issue with relation to the targeting of civil society groups who aid immigrants at the border and targeting them as criminals for aiding what CBP might call illegal entry. A lot of these civil society groups are also stretched beyond capacity in terms of they're able to provide legal and other forms of aid. So now that I've painted this rather bleak picture of what it's like for transgender migrants and migrants in general, I do want to talk about some of the forms of resiliency that have emerged during this time, both migrant advocacy network-led and civil society-led. There are a few different examples of groups that have come together, though it is critical to note that a lot of these groups are pretty transient and exist for maybe 1 to 2 years as resources and capacity allows. First, here are some examples of some shelters and other types of groups that have emerged. The Jardín de las Mariposas was a shelter in Tijuana that specialized in drug rehabilitation, specifically working with those who suffer from emotional and drug abuse due to abuse of their sexual orientation. You also have collectives that are very different from shelters, but are almost like a cooperative style home and situation, such as Casa de Luz, which provides community empowerment, STD prevention, health and nutrition workshops, and even supports transgender migrants in finding housing in the area as they wait to apply for asylum at the border. Casa de Luz has also promoted legal workshops, to know your rights workshops, etc. and provided a collective environment in which migrants are able to work together and self-organize. Places like Casa Arcoiris has expanded their programs to include medical attention, legal support, and I think very importantly, mental health services. After talking with different health providers of clinics along the border, many say that the linchpin for success of these programs often comes down to whether or not trans migrants will use the services available to them. And a lot of that comes down to their comfort in seeking help and securing their mental health. Resistance workshops are also very important, including in building community and perception of what they can do next, as whether they stay in Mexico or move on to the US. And so I added some more here. I'm happy to share my presentation after, but there are definitely some wonderful examples. This is an example not in Tijuana, but actually in Juarez, of a trans women founded shelter who protected Central American transgender migrants for 2021, and then worked with Santa Fe Dreamers Project to enter the US and get sponsorship, and are currently, all 33 women who were in the shelter are now seeking settlement in the United States. And I won't go too much into this, but it's been a really important feature of this resiliency building has been the building of coalitions. This is not new, however, finding like-minded organizations and building a more responsive network to the needs of this population has been integral to the support provided. Groups like the Refugee Health Alliance and the Integral Network of Migrant Assistance have specifically gathered to produce resources that help trans migrants in particular. And Otro Lado and Prevencasa partner to direct trans migrants to other gender-affirming low-cost services in the area. Where do we stand now and what can we do to collaborate? Ultimately, my takeaways from my research at this point is that there is an utter lack of data and analysis of the needs of these populations. A lot of the anecdotes that are put forth are from individuals, and while poignant, do not lend to satisfactory policy response. Collaboration between promotion of evidence-based quantitative and qualitative research is of utmost importance right now on both transgender people experience in Latin America as well as in the border region. Due to the hostility of treatment of many trans people at the border, it's also important that we collaborate with educators and government to include trauma-informed and gender sensitivity training in the CBP and USCIS. This is also true for any sort of care models accessed within the border cities. This is starting to happen in some places, as well as the education of care providers in how to provide care specifically for trans people. I think ultimately one of the more important things for long-term support in this region is the continuation of education of border communities in the US about their neighboring cities to build a sense of community and shared vision for how to understand the border region as a whole. Promotion of the shift from narratives like crisis of migration to the crisis of administration are highly useful in this regard. And finally, but not least, I also want to mention that US-based advocates and organizations can work harder to help secure more funding for these low resource settings. There are so many people on the ground willing to help and interested in helping, and yet the resources are so limited, obviously from across the board. But LGBTQ border research and LGBTQ migrant analysis will be particularly useful in providing a more sensitive model that not only helps trans people, but also other migrants as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Thea. Excellent presentation. Thank you, everybody on the panel. We have some questions, and I'll turn to those now in the time that we have left for the Q&A. And I just wanted to reiterate what was said at the previous panel on education. I think this also provides the opportunity for the presenters and the audience to continue to communicate with each other, to share their findings, their research, and their ideas, and hopefully some collaborative projects will also come out of this. Let me refer to one of the questions is from Efren, one of our own presenters, to Dr. Villafuerte. Una pregunta para usted, Dr. Villafuerte. ¿Por qué se dispara la migración de Honduras y de Guatemala a El Salvador disminuye o permanece estable? Why is the migration from Honduras shot up and increased greatly, whereas from Guatemala and El Salvador, it's either stayed the same or has even decreased, is the question for Dr. Villafuerte.
Gracias por la pregunta. Me parece que el caso de Honduras es el paradigma de la migración, de la expulsión de población. Las condiciones de pobreza, de violencia, de una economía extractivista que polariza a la población, da como resultado justamente, y la presencia del narcotráfico también, porque eso es un elemento que contribuye a la generación de violencia. Eso explica poco la superioridad, la preeminencia de la población expulsada en territorio, hacia territorio mexicano y posteriormente a Estados Unidos. En el caso de El Salvador es una migración que tiene ya mucho tiempo. Las redes migratorias están muy consolidadas. Hay nuevas maneras, digamos, de cómo eludir las fronteras a través del pago de intermediarios, de coyotes, etcétera. Y por eso uno puede notar claramente que siempre los números de asilados, de solicitudes de asilo y de incluso del flujo migratorio es menor, porque ya hay una consolidación de larga data, ¿no? Y en el caso de Guatemala también las cifras son menores porque dada la vecindad, hay un efecto de vecindad muy importante y esto hace que esta población guatemalteca permanezca incluso bajo ciertos acuerdos que hay con México para el trabajo temporal, pero ahí se quedan y es posible que haya una filtración a través de redes, ¿no?
Excelente, gracias. Déjame traducir la respuesta. So, Dr. Villafuerte pointed out that Honduras really is a paradigm case of forced migration. It's where you see all of the contributing factors or root causes, everything from the effects of climate change to continuing poverty and inequality, the impacts of the extractivist economic model of mining and so on. On top of that, the violence of drug trafficking cartels and organizations and impunity with which they act. So all of those conditions have made it extremely difficult for people to just survive in Honduras. El Salvador has a longer history, more established consolidated networks of migrants from El Salvador to the United States, where people know how this works and in paying off the coyotes to get across into Mexico. And it's noticeable that the asylum petitions from El Salvadoran people, migrants, are much lower than we're seeing from Honduras. But that seems to be a much more longer consolidated history of migration from El Salvador. Whereas Honduras, we see a more recent kind of spike because of the combined effects of all of those issues and pressures. And in Guatemala, it's also a bit smaller, mainly because of the proximity to Mexico, which allows poor Guatemalans to stay living in Guatemala and find temporary work across the border in Mexico with some agreements with employers as temporary laborers or farm workers, and also that being tied into their own networks, which allow for some of that explanation. So thank you very much, Dr. Villafuerte, for that. I have another question. This is one for Dr. Solís. Una pregunta para usted, doctor, from Daniel Aguilar. And that, let me read it in Spanish. It's in here in the Q&A. Usted nota en su presentación la ausencia de gobierno en algunos de los municipios más pequeños que han sido capturados por elementos del crimen organizado. Y la pregunta va, ¿tener estos elementos criminales presentes en estas áreas donde el gobierno está ausente eleva económicamente el territorio o empeora sus condiciones económicas? Y luego otra pregunta, ¿se pueden aplicar estas preguntas de manera amplia o son específicas de cada municipio? Es la pregunta, doctor. Déjame traducirlo antes. So the question there was, does the capture of municipalities, of local governments by drug cartels increase the economic conditions, or does it worsen those economic conditions? And is this case specific municipality by municipality, or could it be applied generally? Adelante.
Muchas gracias, doctor Harvey. Y gracias también por la pregunta. Comenzaría por la segunda parte de la pregunta, en el sentido de que si el empeoramiento que se registra o no económicamente a nivel municipal se puede plantear. Yo diría que sí, hay evidentemente un empeoramiento de las condiciones económicas en estas escalas municipales. Y esto está vinculado al fenómeno de la violencia que ya se ha estado refiriendo también aquí. Para el caso del sur de México, logré puntualizar, pero, por ejemplo, con esta violencia criminal está asociado una serie de fenómenos. O sea, hay un incremento en el homicidio doloso, por ejemplo, secuestro, robo con violencia, extorsión, etc. Entonces, esto hace que las condiciones de estas regiones, que de por sí son precarias, pues, y esto se observa más a nivel nacional. Tenemos regiones en México en donde se puede ver el amplio desplazamiento de poblaciones a causa precisamente de la violencia, lo que se llama o se ha nombrado como desplazamiento interno forzado. O sea, son regiones que a causa precisamente del predominio del narcotráfico y de la pugna que hay entre carteles, ha llevado al desplazamiento, ¿no?, de comunidades enteras. Entonces eso ha tenido como consecuencia pues un agravamiento de la situación económica en todo el país, de hecho.
Okay, thank you for the answer. The answer is that conditions are worsening because of this capture of local government by cartel criminal organizations. The already precarious economic conditions that Dr. Solís described as the context for the situation that we have now have been made worse. So in these locations that he's referring to, in southern Mexico particularly, we've seen an increase in the number of homicides, kidnappings, extortion, and robbery. All of this makes economic conditions much worse. And this could be applied to other parts of Mexico, where in some regions we've seen many people who are displaced from their communities due to those same factors, extortion, robbery, but also the competition, the violent competition between cartels for those territories, leading to what's known as internal forced displacement. So all of this leads to a worsening of the economic conditions for Mexicans. Thank you. I think we're done on the Q&A. I just see a couple of comments. Mary Church says, great presentation, Thea. And there's another question that has been answered, so we're good there. So thank you everybody for your presentations. We have now some poster presentations we can go to within our program. And then our next panel is on food systems and the impact of the pandemic on food production and food workers. So thank you everybody, and we'll see you either at the poster presentations or the next panel.